We're going to take this text of 2 Samuel chapter 7. So if you want to open your Bibles there. And I want to just talk about art, music, worship, creativity, and ultimately following Jesus. And what it means to find. I've kind of given this a title that's pretty, but it's thought-provoking. But I've just been on this study and this understanding of church fathers and mothers who've taught us this incredible, beautiful thing called finding our way home on the road to nowhere. That's my way of saying it. Finding our way home on the road to nowhere. Years ago, I remember being on a silent retreat. I've been going on silent retreats, and now my son Samuel comes with me. My father-in-law started taking me 30 years ago on 4 days of silence, and it was so transformative for me. And often on these retreats, you'll get great prayers of saints and such. And I came across this prayer years ago, and it startled me growing up. You know, I'm a good evangelical. You know, this stuff is radical. Prayer of Thomas Merton. This is a guy who spends all of his days praying out there in the woodlands of Kentucky. This is his prayer. Lord, I have no idea where I'm going. That right there, as a kid growing up in evangelical church, I would never, ever hear that. That just startled me. It doesn't startle me as much anymore, but I wish it did, because it's so beautiful. Lord, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. As a 51-year-old, I feel like I can even say that with more authority than as a 31-year-old or a 21-year-old for sure. I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe the desire to please you does in fact please you. I believe, Lord, that my desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in all that I'm doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire to please you. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to take my journey alone. Merton got a lot from Heschel, right? He says this, I've been reading this book. This is a great little tool to do if you ever read books. This is how I've done it. I learned this from my father-in-law. As you're reading it, you just go page by page through it and then put the awesome quotes. It's an awesome way to do it. Nowadays you can just take a picture of it and then you can see it's a great way to go through. He says this, listen to this. Whenever you come up on a challenge, do not despair. Suzanne Heschel's daughter said her father always forbid despair in their household. He said, it's okay to doubt, it's okay to be afraid, but don't despair. Because despair is resisting a reality, and that reality is that God is near. God knows exactly where you are, that God is listening. And prayer is never inactivity. Prayer is the greatest activity. Prayer is an event. Every time you pray, it's an event. Why? Because where your words fail, God enters the moment. So he says this, he says, despair is forbidden. To despair is to deny that God is present with us, caring for us. And it also denies this, that there is no challenge that we are given without the resources to cope. That is so powerful. There is no challenge that we are given right now without the resources to cope. We actually think we have to go look for the resources, or we have to go get the resources. We got to go find the resources. And God says, isn't it amazing? There's no challenge that's here that there is not a resource to cope. That is so powerful to me. Because years ago, I used to always start picking up on that reality. Half the church doesn't even know who Abraham Joshua Heschel is. They've never read Eugene Peterson. They've never read Kierkegaard. They've never read. People don't even, the resources are there for us. They're already there. God's already placed prophets among us. We're just not listening to them. They've already told us. They've already said, hey, by the way, I've been in a monastery for 30 years, but I have no idea where I'm going. And I'm okay with that, because me knowing where I'm going isn't what is pleasing to God. It's my desire to please God that does in fact please him. And as long as I keep the desire to please him, right? And I don't confidently, keep saying out loud, I'm a child of God and I please God, but I have since I lost the desire to please him long ago. Right? That's just an expression. The activity is, I have no idea where I'm going, Lord, and I'm willing to go. I really trust you. The activity of my life actually trusts you. I'm not just saying I trust you. I'm willing to trust you. And to trust you means sometimes it has to go dark. Because if it never goes dark for me and I'm the one that gets to direct my steps, I don't ever learn how to trust. This is difficult, even in the worship circle, isn't it? You don't want to get up and preach and not know where you're going. I always say that to Broden. I say that one of the worst things that can ever happen to me is that I continue to grow in the Lord. Because if I continue to grow in the Lord, I'm too present to not go there in front of the people. And often you don't have language. It's like Lucy said in the Don Trotter book, C.S. Lewis said this brilliantly through Lucy. He wrote this, but it's such a brilliant idea. He said, she says, and Aslan said, but I'm not sure he spoke. That's so profound. Of course Aslan said, but I'm not sure he spoke, because that's what happens to us all the time. God's speaking something to you, but you don't even have the language for it yet. But you've already been transformed without even knowing what he said, but something was said. You even have a sense for it, but you can't even express it yet. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you, worship leader, is God's actually doing an activity in your life right before you get on the platform. What do you do now? You can't even explain what God's doing, but you're so undone in the moment. But we don't have time for that. You can't be undone. You got to know where you're going. How do you lead the people if you don't know where you're going? And that's the question. How did Jesus lead the people without knowing where he was going? Trusting in God for everything. I don't even say one word. This is the ultimate act of worship. I don't even say one word that I don't first hear my Father say. I don't even do one thing that I don't first see my Father do. This is radical. But I thank God for these people. Heschel and Merton and their honest prayers. Second Samuel, David, he's won all these battles. And he says, now when the king lived in his house after he'd won all his battles and he's feeling a little peaceful, And the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies. The king said to Nathan the prophet, see, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, Well, go do all that's in your heart, for the Lord's with you. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house? You're going to build me a house to dwell? I've not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. Oh man, I love that. The God of everything said, I've been moving around in a tent for my dwelling. Wait a second, you're gonna build a house for me? When have I ever asked through all the judges, hey, will somebody build me a house? That's what God says. It goes on to say, somebody please build me a house. You go tell this to my servant David. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. So we'll go back to that. Listen. It's an interesting thing when you study music and art in the world and even the work of the Holy Spirit in churches. You know, we start with this upper room experience, right? But it's interesting how we build these. If you've ever noticed, something happens, something beautiful happens, often in small places where there's space enough for something beautiful to happen. Something that's never happened before. There's space enough to be creative because there's space enough to not know where we're going. It's like Merton used to say this in Raids in the Unspeakable. He said, we're all trying to fill the space while God's trying to empty it. So God's trying to make things void and open again. And the minute in our human tendencies, we get so nervous about that. And we fill the space up as fast as God's trying to make space. But if we only understood with eyes of faith that the Lord intends to hover over the space and the void with the presence of the Holy Spirit to make something new, something you've never experienced before. Maybe we'd have the faith and courage not to fill it up so quickly. This is where music happens. I mean, music happens in upper rooms. You notice this? Back rooms, basements, garages. I've been in small pubs in Dublin where musicians just walk up in off the street. They just kind of collect together, and then somebody comes in, has their violin, and they just start playing together. Back porches, living rooms, barns. Space is important to God. And so there's something that happens as we become experts of a certain form, right? And then we create these patterns, right? So something amazing happens, and then all of a sudden, what do? We raise the money, and then we build like a $12 million, now it's $25 million or $30 million facility for the arts. But still, like my wife just told me the other day, she said, babe, we got to go to Chicago. There's this place in Chicago, evidently, where she's telling me this. She's a 7 on the Enneagram, so it's like, she says, we gotta sometime go down there. There's this place in Chicago where nobody really knows it, but you gotta go down into this basement. And you go into this back kind of area and you walk into this dark alley and then you go down this basement. I'm like, this is a terrible idea. In Chicago, we're gonna get killed. You go in this back place and then there's these comedians that just come out of nowhere and they're just start doing their thing and nobody's ever heard of them and it's amazing. I said, that sounds like a really awesome experience, but terrifying. Because I'm definitely not strong enough to beat up all these guys that are going to take us out in the back alley of Chicago going to see this back. But isn't it unbelievable? You can create all you want. We can always create these things, and then without our permission, people, they don't go to the $30 million facility. They go to, oh, did you hear about what's going on in that back room, in that basement over there? That's so frustrating to humanity because we just wish we could just lock it more. I wish I could lock it in more. I wish I knew what I was doing half the time. Because then you could brand it and you could figure it, Listen to this. This is what Eugene Peterson said in his 70s as being a pastor all of his life. He says, let me just tell you this. In the company of Jesus, there are no experts. There are only beginners and necessary followers. In the company of Jesus, there are no experts. That's a big statement. In the company of Jesus, in the company of Jesus, there are no experts, like ever. There are no experts, there are only beginners and necessary followers. Because in the company of Jesus, nobody knows where they're going. I play with some really great musicians, and I always say to the greatest musician among us, you got to get off the page more. And to the one that can hardly play the song, you should probably stay on the page and learn how to play the song so you can get off the page. But to those that are better, you ought to be even more off the page. In the company of Jesus, there are no experts. There are only beginners and necessary followers because in the company of Jesus, nobody knows where they're going. How about this? Wendell Berry, the great, prophet, poet, from Kentucky, says this. He says, in his 90s, he wrote this. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we've come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we've actually begun our real journey. You got to be 90 to say this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? The mind, listen to this. The mind that is not baffled. Think about this for every time we walk into church or we're talking about the Lord. If it doesn't in some way baffle, if I'm never baffled, if my mind's never baffled, if I never have my phone over long enough, or I'm so actively listening to somebody, I can never be surprised. I remember years ago on retreat, there was Father Larry Gillick, a Jesuit who's blind. And I think in some ways he became blind at 8 from a fall, but he became one of the great Jesuits because he was so creative. He wasn't on the page. I think he had to memorize every poem if he wanted to read it. Everything was like liquid listening to him. And we'd go on retreats and you didn't know if what's he quoting? Is that him or is that Mary Oliver? You never knew. And it was just like liquid. It was like, I used to always say to him, you're like a beat poet. You just get up and he'd put his Braille Bible on his lap and then click it on and I remember one time I took all these worship leaders from all over the country. They came in to see this guy that I had talked about for years, Father Larry Gillick, who has no books out. Nobody knows who he is. He's taken a vow of poverty. If you look on YouTube, he'll have 90 views of something he did, And I'm telling all these famous worship leaders that this guy's like the best thing that's ever happened to me. And they all come and they just trust me. So they all fly up to Wisconsin in the middle of the winter and they come to see Father Gillick. In his first talk, the first night, he's in a new space that they just built there at the Jesuit Retreat House. And he wants to walk it alone. So he walks up and he walks up. So now tonight we're going to have Father Larry Gillick. And he walks up and the first thing he does is he runs into the wall. He runs right into the wall. And then he hits the wall and everybody is just at the right age where we're respectful of our adults. We're not flippant about this moment. Should we get up? Should we help him? Is that dishonoring to help him? Does he want to do it alone? It was that moment. And all my friends are like looking at me. These are people that are used to being at the Passion Conference. There ain't nobody doing that. You know what I mean? The Passion Conference is awesome, but it's like, this is not a cool entry. And he runs into the wall and then he walks his way down the wall. And then he sits down on this chair and then he opens his Braille Bible and he flips on the old lapel mic and then he says, and we don't even know it at the time, he's quoting Mary Oliver, things take the time they take. Silence. And I look over at my friend, one of my buddies, I won't mention who it was, he looks over at me, his eyes just filling with tears. Because he knows he's met the match. He's in the moment. God has him exactly where he wants him. He's undone. And so the whole weekend, and we don't even, Father Larry Gillick. Who's Father Larry Gillick? Well, you probably hear about him listening. If you get online, it'll be me talking about him. Because nobody knows who Father Larry Gillick is, but he's life transforming. That's how God works. I remember one time he was talking. That's why I brought him up. And he said, you know how somebody's really humble? They still carry the ability to be surprised. So I love that. The mind that's not baffled is unemployed. It's not you're humble, no, the joy of that, the childlikeness of that, the wonder of that, the beauty of that, the energy of that. It's like the growth of that, the life of it. If life is that I continue to keep growing, if bios is that the energy is that I keep growing, that I have never arrived, that I can still be surprised. Break the bread, pour the wine. Break the bread, pour the wine. Surprise me, Jesus, with your presence. Come in a way that I least expect you. F.W. Borum, I don't know if you've ever heard of anybody heard of F.W. Borum? F.W. Borum. I've written a lot of songs off of some of his sermons. F.W. Borum was a prodigy of Spurgeon, who was an expository preacher, but F.W. Borum didn't like preaching expositorily. He loved telling stories, but nobody had ever done it before. And so he weaves these stories. If you ever want to read a great F.W. Borum book, read Shadows on the Wall. Unbelievable. I wrote the song Scarecrow out of that because he was walking down the street one day and he looks into this kitchen garden and he sees this kitchen garden and he said, look at that. There's a beautiful kitchen garden and there's a scarecrow. Oh, and there's two birds that are just sitting there so peacefully. And then he starts laughing to himself and he says, isn't that something? I'm going to give these birds names. I'm going to name this bird. Because he realizes these birds aren't getting the point. They're just hanging out so peacefully on the arms of this scarecrow. They're supposed to be scared. He looks at him and he says, I'm going to give these birds names. I'm going to name this bird the foolish bird, and I'm going to name this bird the wise bird. And he says, and if I was the foolish bird, every time I saw a scarecrow, I'd fly away and be afraid. But if I was a wise bird, I would fly around every municipality every city street, into every church steeple, into every government place, into every field. And I would look for scarecrows if I was a wise bird, because I know if I could find a scarecrow, well, I just found myself a beautiful garden. That's F.W. Borum. Well, I found out I'm good friends with Billy Graham's eldest grandson. And Stefan was telling me, he said, that was my granddad's favorite preacher. In fact, when Billy Graham went to New Zealand to preach, he got off the plane in the 1950s, and the first person he wanted to find was F.W. Borum. He went to his house to go meet him because this man was, but he was unconventional, and because he was unconventional, if you go try to find a first edition copy in England of one of his books and you find one, if you can find one for under £1,000, good luck, because he was unpopular, so therefore there wasn't great prints of his books. And then he became super popular because he was such a good preacher. And I came across one of his books. It's called The Other Side of the Hill. Well, I just turned 51, so I'm like, I got to read about the other side of the hill. What's on the other side of that hill, man? Jeepers. And so he said, my friend and I, this is how he opens up the other side of the hill, and this just caught me. He says, my friend and I, we're spinning along in this car. Now, this was in the early 1900s, and they're spinning along somewhere in Australia on this road in this car. And I'm thinking that had to be one of the first cars. You know what I mean? It's definitely, and they're just spinning along in this car, and they're out on this ride, and he says, and there's a towering mountain and shining harbor behind us. Whilst, you know he's old if he uses that word, each bend in the road presented us with a fresh unfolding of ceaseless panorama of woodland, pasture, and stream. Then he says this, we were bound for nowhere. And as far as we could tell, this road led us there. We were out for the pure sake of being out. First time I heard that, I got together with my worship buddies that we were leading worship somewhere, and I said, guys, we are bound for nowhere, and as far as we can tell, this road's going to lead us there. That's not a way to open up a worship night. You know what I mean? Hey, guys, we're bound for nowhere, but it's exactly the way you ought to open it up. We're bound for nowhere, he says, and as far as I can tell, this road leads there. We're out for the pure sake of being out. Where am I? Where am I? These are the questions. What am I doing? And God asks them too. This is some of the same questions. Where am I? What am I doing? What are you doing, Jason? And what are you becoming by what you're doing? This is the beauty that God's a potter and not a press. He's not a press. Because a press doesn't care for its creation. God's a potter. He cares for his creation. He reverences even your resistance. He reverences resistance like Jonah. He reverences your resistance. And he utilizes even your resistance and shapes and forms you with it. Just like a great potter would. He keeps you on the wheel, and a great potter will reverence the resistance and use that resistance, that moving away, to shape you. We often want to make, and I know why, because I was a parent of 4 kids. I'd love to be a press. But the way of God doesn't form children by press. Sometimes you want to go the easy way. You just like to just put them on. The church is just a big conveyor belt. It's like a manufacturing center. Just pa-pum, Christian, pa-pum, Christian, pa-pum, Christian. It just doesn't work that way. And so what does the potter do? Oh, Jay, come on, Jay. Sit down. You're 48. So what are you becoming by what you're doing? If you just be quiet long enough, you'll hear that from the Lord. So what are we becoming, Jay? What are you becoming? What are you doing? You know how many times I've had to answer that? What are you becoming? What you're doing? And God will just, okay, so Where am I? What am I doing? And what have I become doing what it is that I'm doing? And where can I find meaning? That's powerful because we are a people not of satisfaction. Abraham Heschel taught us that, and Christians actually picked up on it even sometimes, I think more. He said that more than the Jewish church picked up on it. But, Heschel was big in the time, Freud, where Freud would say man was made for satisfaction. And Heschel came out and said, oh, yes, man, it's made for satisfaction, but it's made for something far more than that. It's made for meaning. And even deeper than that, it's made for appreciation. Which now, what do we have? We didn't even, this was in the 50s that he was living. But we have now, you go, I didn't even like the Beatles, and all of a sudden you're watching Netflix and you're watching, somebody talking about the Beatles, and what's happening, the greater the appreciation, the greater the satisfaction. So Heschel would say, no, satisfaction isn't what brings you there. Appreciation, meaning. What did we say about the Lord earlier? I understand you even from a far distance away. I understand your thoughts. I listen to your words. I investigate your pathways and your lying down. The greater the appreciation, right? The greater the sense of meaning, the greater, the satisfaction. Where can I find something sacred, or more colloquially said, right? Where are you, God? Where's God? I just want to push into this. Heschel, he pushed on that. Where is God? Where is God? And this is Old Testament thought. Where is God? Where is God? Heschel said, the earth is filled with the glory of God to such a degree man can't even handle it. So what do? I wrote a song called Clouds and Creed on this idea, you're too much for me. Sometimes you're in the clouds, sometimes people are like, what are you doing? Are you smoking weed or something, Upton? No, I've never done drugs. I'm just listening to Heschel and trying to write on this concept. You're too much for me. What's the concept? What does humanity do? He says, humanity, the earth is filled with the glory of God, covered, filled, pregnant with the glory of God. To such a degree, humanity can't handle it. So what do? We create religious routine. And that routine becomes actually resistance to wonder. So he says this, he says, where is God? The earth is filled with the glory of God to such a degree we can't even handle it. So we create this religious routine. So where is God? God is where you let God enter. That's God is wherever you let God enter. We're talking about doors today. We're talking about the key of David. We're talking about Jesus being given the key of David that opens doors that nobody can close and closes doors that nobody can shut. God's wherever you let God enter. Prayer is an event wherein we open a door to God. Heschel was a refugee because he escaped, ironically, he wrote the greatest work on the prophets ever written as a college student at the University of Berlin in 1933. It's called The Prophets. That was his doctoral thesis, ironically. Goes back to Poland, and he's sent to save his life. And all of these massive people that he found so much of the glory of God with, these old men and women of the faith that he grew up with that were so on fire for wonder and the glory of God. They were all killed by the Nazis. He escaped and ended up in the United States. And it wasn't until later, when he got to the United States, he became so frustrated because he'd go into the synagogue and he'd say, Man, the synagogue is the place where it seems prayer is buried. It's like where it's died. Our motto is monotony. What was will be. Our edifices are growing, but prayer is decaying. Right? This kind of stuff, right? He said this, he said, it's like God has become, oh, thank you. It's like God has become a refugee. It's like God has become it's like God has become a refugee, he said, in his own land with his own people. So he'd come into synagogue and he'd say, it's like God has become a refugee in his own land with his own people. If you look online, he's the only Jewish rabbi that's marching with King on Selma, at Selma. And he actually said all these, just think about this, how radical this was in the 1950s. He was asked by synagogue leaders, what would be the best thing for the synagogue? What would be the best thing for the synagogue? And he said, the black church. That's what he said. That's amazing. You let them in here. Because that's the thing that reminds me the most. They don't make God a refugee in his own land. They're awake to his presence. Every prayer is an event. That's how it was back in my homeland with my people. And I come here, and you've created such religious routine, you're resisting God. God becomes a refugee in his own homeland and his own people. Oh, cheap. Is it just me, or am I like, why don't more people know about this stuff? I read it and I think, jeepers, Just a couple more things, and I'll be done. So I'm not going to go very long, but I just wanted to, and I'll give you some time for answers, questions and answers. Or maybe you'll answer, and then I'll ask some questions. Eugene Peterson, in one of his books, he says this, and I'm doing this purposely. I'm just reading through quotes of old people because I just think they should be heard and listened to. Years ago, I was traveling along this spectacular mountain road, he says, with an old college friend who was visiting from Texas. And this road is one of the scenic wonders of North America. And my friend had a map open on her knees. And I kept pointing out features in the landscape around us. Over here was this 500-foot waterfall. And over here was a glacial formation. And over here was a grove of master and western red cedars. And there was this distant horizon of mountains on which a storm was forming over here. And he says, I kept saying all these things and pointing out all these things that were right around us. And she just rarely looked up and was just staring at the map. And when I, with some impatience, tried to get her attention, she told me that she wanted to, quote, know where we were. And I just want to know where we are. I just want to know where we are, Gene. And apparently, he says, knowing where we are for her was defined by a line on a map. She preferred the abstraction of a road map to the actual colors and forms, the scent and the texture of Mount Reynolds, the roar of Logan Creek, an alpine meadow on the way to Pegan Pass, which is luxurious in bare grass. Where is God? God is where we let God enter. And one of the things that's very difficult about following Jesus is the way that Jesus meets us where we least expect to find him and where we often would rather not be. Can I say that again? One of the things that's the most difficult about following Jesus, if you just take the Gospels and even the disciples, and then you don't think, oh, Peter, what an idiot. You go, oh, how am I like Peter? right? One of the things that's very difficult about following Jesus is that Jesus meets us where we least expect to find him and where we often would rather not be. And all throughout history, God's always wanted to make a flesh and bone house. I think one of the greatest places we don't want to be is right here. And we often don't want God to be right here. To make his presence in my flesh and bone house the way he really wants to. The way that will transform the world. If I'll let him enter. I wrote this down on my way here. If Jesus was a house guest, you know, I'm a pretty, if you ask, I am a host. And if you come to my home or you go in my car, it is going to be atrocious to me. It will be abhorrent to me if I make you ride in my car and it's a filthy mess. I've got to clean that up and get it all. You know, I am a guy who wants to, you know. But if Jesus was a house guest, I have this idea that he would enter my house like he entered the world. He'd be the kind of house guest that would enter the house and immediately head for the basement or the attic or the closet that you threw everything in before he came over because you thought it looked better. And he's totally comfortable being there. I'm not entirely comfortable with all the places that Jesus seems perfectly at peace dwelling. This is why we were talking about it yesterday. It's not that I don't think things need to be exposed. God is obviously exposing, but God doesn't expose. God reconciles. God restores. God heals. God goes the long way. God goes to the places that nobody else wants to be to bring full healing in your life. God doesn't just send you off somewhere so that your despicable embarrassment will no longer embarrass him anymore. That's not how God is with us. God, if you'll just, where is God? He's wherever you let him enter. Because he fills the earth with glory. And if you'll just let him enter. There's an old guy that used to manage, I was talking about last night. I'm way off my things, but you got to hear this. I just remembered this. A guy named Daniel Bates. And years ago, he was like a manager for Paul Abdul and Jennifer Lopez and all these. I mean, and he was models and all these people that he would send to places. And I'm going to leave out of this conversation. And he was a mess, and he was a massive drug addict and alcoholic. And then he gets radically saved, and then he finds Melody Green, Keith Green's wife, and says, just get me somewhere where I can find the real thing. And she says, well, I want you to meet a friend of mine, Jason Upton. So he comes to Nashville, and I'm playing somewhere, and we begin this friendship. And early on, he said, well, let me help you in some way. I'll manage you. So my father-in-law reluctantly let him manage, but oh boy, he was, so if he saw anything, bad, he would just start cursing people out. And it was just so I actually had to tell him, you're not gonna be able to do this for me anymore, Daniel. He was like, oh, so amazing the way you just fired me, Jay. I just feel like I've never been fired and felt so great about myself. So he says to me, I said, well, I didn't really fire you. You can't Anyway, I won't say the names, but there's some pretty high-profile people that actually he may have been picking up on some things, actually, now that I look back. But it's like he would see something that he didn't think was right, and then he would just go for it and destroy it. But he was at our house one night, and my brother-in-law, he had had a breakdown in his life and his marriage and everything, and his wife had left him for another man, and it was kind of a mess. And so he was living up at the lake. He was quite a bit older than me, and he had a really bad smoking addiction. And Daniel was there for the weekend. And Daniel had this New York accent. He was like, you need to talk like this. You know what I mean? It was like so, I wish I could do it because it was so awesome. But you were like, yeah, bunch of perverts. You know, I just want the real thing. Church is a bunch of perverts. You know, he would always be like that. It was like so, and I never even ever had a drink, and he decided when I was in New York ministering one time, he came and brought me to the oldest AAA meeting. He thought that I needed to come to this oldest AA meeting, so I sat in an AA meeting with him. He's like, yeah, Jay, you're just an alcoholic who's never had a drink. That's what he said. You know, that's the way he would talk. So he's there, and he sees my brother-in-law smoking, and he says, hey, David, you want to be free of that? So they're outside, and David's like, yeah, sure. He said, well, this is what you do. Stop doing it by yourself. Do it with God. Dave was like, what do you mean, Dan? Like smoke with God? He's like, absolutely. That's what we do. That's how we do it wrong. We never get free because we never let God in. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're doing, whatever perverted thing you're doing. That's how we talk, you know. It was terrible. I'm a kid from the Midwest. Nobody ever say that. And he'd be like, yeah, you just let God in, and God will meet you there. So, you know, we're up at the lake, and we have the windows open, and we can hear Dave out there. And he told him exactly how to do it. He gave him kind of a little routine in a good way. He was like, you just light it up, and then you say, God, I'm smoking. That's how he said it. He said, and so I'd hear Dave outside, and he'd be like, God, I'm smoking. You know, but he didn't have the accent. It was like, God, I'm smoking. You know, it was like, you know, it was so funny. And sure enough, within a few weeks, he just let God in, and the addiction left, and he hasn't smoked since. I know that sounds like crazy. But all he did was, where's God? He's wherever you let him enter. Where's God? And all of us know what that's like. It could be an argument you're having, or you know you've crossed the line. You know, you've crossed the line. You know, how many times you crossed the line with your spouse, you know, and you know you crossed it. It's just better to just go, all right, God, I'm here, and I just crossed the line. Just do that. It'd be amazing. Your wife would probably start laughing, you know. So here we are. God's always longed for that flesh and bone house, and ultimately it's in you and me. He comes into the world, and he can be found not so much in the temples of Herod or synagogues, but with people like you all hang out with here, you know. With lepers and the lonely, broken, injured, blind, the deaf, the scared, poor in spirit. He initiated encounter with us. But like I said, he often initiates that encounter in places I'd rather not be. He says, I want to build a house that will last longer than forever. A flesh and bone house. And I will meet you. And I'll be found where you'd rather not be, Jason. But if you can begin to stop, if you can begin to stop running, to slow yourself down and return to the house that I choose to dwell, I'll meet you there. Find your way home on the road to nowhere. Find your way home to the house God built for his presence, and he'll meet you there. Where are you, God? I'm wherever you allow me to enter. Jesus says, man, I'm gonna open up doors that no man can shut. I just think there's a whole nother door waiting to be opened. That God wants to enter more than we could ever imagine, more than we could ever dream up. It can't be that we were talking about the other day, it can't be that we're just, okay, this is really, because this is actually sin. It's actually sin to be excited about another person being exposed. Wendell Berry talks about this. It's like somebody's exposed and they're exposed of their sin. Well, what does that do? It's just a voyeuristic, sinful thing that we just all are so excited about. We're particularly excited about it if we've been hurt by those people that are exposed. But that's not Jesus. It doesn't mean that sin isn't going to be exposed. It's just that that's not the goal for God. The goal for God is restoration. The goal for God is healing. The goal for God can be heard in the voice of my father-in-law, whose brother was going to commit suicide, but then decides not to in the last minute, drops his pride, calls him on the phone, my father-in-law. It's 3 a.m. He's like, I was going to end it all, but I need to come home. I need to come be with you. I need Jesus. Stops fighting and opens himself up. And Peter says, he wrote a book on it called My Brother Bob's Greatest Hour. That's the greatest hour. God wants to open us up. And if you'll open it up, I'll meet you there. You'll find me there.